Hello and welcome back to the channel. My name is Muriel and in this video I will be doing a review of Renee Denfeld's The Enchanted. The Enchanted is, as you can see, a shortish novel I read at the beginning of the month and that I wouldn't even have heard about really had it not been recommended, then gifted to me by a friend. Thank you to the friend in question. It is thus a story I didn't know much about beyond the base premise my friend had shared with me, and for which I thus didn't hold any specific expectations beyond, the confidence I had in the value of the recommendation itself. And well, to my pleasant surprise, this turned out to be a very good recommendation indeed. The Enchanted is a story that takes place in and around a male prison somewhere in the United States, and more or less centers on a female investigator called the Lady in the story, whose job is to gather evidence that will allow defense attorneys to take inmates off of death row and back into life imprisonment 99% of the time, not back to freedom, as the vast majority of the Lady's clients are in fact guilty of their often horrific crimes. The story starts as she takes on a new case and is narrated by another unnamed inmate who calls the prison an enchanted place, for reasons you shall discover should you decide to read this book. The Enchanted is very firmly general fiction, though it does at times feel somewhat like magical realism because of its narrator, whose identity you don't discover until the very end of the story. This narrator seems strangely omniscient and knows things you really shouldn't, given you know he is also an inmate on death row, and he also describes fantastical things that could either be taken literally as magical insertions into ordinary reality, or the imaginative perceptions of a rather unstable mind. Now, I personally think it's more the latter than the former, but the ambiguity remains, and that's why you could argue this tale can be classified as light magical realism. The Enchanted is thus only told through this omniscient character's point of view, but it observes several different secondary narrative strands that weave back into the primary one of the Lady as she carries out her investigative work. Most of the story moves forward in time, but it also includes flashbacks necessary to the development of the story's theming on the cycle of violence and criminality. I found the prose elegant and quietly powerful. I wrote down several quotes in my notebook, moved and thought-provoked as I was by the way said prose conveyed the story's points about the darkness and light at the heart of the human soul. And this point specifically is important. This is a very dark story. Content warnings apply, but nothing in it felt gratuitous or overly graphic to me, as it is written with, yes, a lot of light and gentleness, for lack of a better word. This novel is a lot more about human nature than it is about individual human character, which is kind of a running theme for general fiction I really enjoy. I wouldn't say it's a theming-driven story as such, but it is an emotion and humanism-driven story in a way, if that makes sense. Plot and character work are thus not the immediate focus in my opinion, yet I found there was actually quite a bit of character depth given to the narrator and the Lady, but also to a priest character and the prison warden. It's interesting because, except for the narrator at the very end of the story, as I already mentioned, you never actually learn those characters' names. Like I said, it's not really the point of the story as such. What matters here is how the characters' backgrounds, psychologies, and more significantly, traumas, contribute to the story's emotional thematic exploration. There's quite a bit here in terms of theming. All of it was delicately layered into the narrative, and whilst all three of the main thematic threads I personally engage with are interconnected, I'll now go through them separately. First, I would say this book discusses the value we place on life, death, and justice. The story, after all, largely takes place on and around death row, but that being said, I don't think the focal point here is the death penalty itself specifically. I see this narrative element more as a springboard of sorts to a broader contemplation of the value we place societally and individually on human life, on the taking of human life as payment for wrongdoing, and how this feeds back into our concepts of justice, fairness, etc. Adjacent to this is a consideration of the punishment of life imprisonment and how this compares, in a way, to the more final one of the death penalty. Of course, how society carries out or miscarries justice in doling out these punishments ties into this thematic thread as well. On a second and somewhat deeper level, I think The Enchanted invites the reader to think about the cycle of violence and, by extension, the origins of violent crime. I don't think there are any hard answers provided in the text. And that's a good thing in my book, because that also means there was no soapboxing here either. I think there is room within the narrative's theming space, don't mind my neologism here, for different readers feeling differently about the hard and dark questions violent crime presents society with. That being said, the narrative definitely acknowledges the attested fact that a lot of violent behavior, and more broadly psychological warping is what I'm going to call it, is rooted in traumatically violent events experienced in one's formative years. Violence, generally speaking, begets violence, and those most vulnerable, women, disabled people, children, suffer the soul-gouging consequences of violence the most. One passage in particular that touches upon this idea really struck and moved me. Men who have not been violated don't understand what it is like to have the edges of your body blurred, to feel that every inch of your skin is a place where fingers can press, that every hole and orifice is a place where others can put parts of their bodies. When your body stops being corporeal, your soul has no place to go, so it finds the next window to escape. To be clear, the book acknowledges sexual violence, specifically, experienced by both women and men, especially as children for the latter, and the fact that, yes, the vast majority of said violence is perpetrated by men. This is a significant fact, tied into the broader theming on the cycle of violence, but I would not say this book otherwise counts as feminist literature stricto sensu, as its analysis doesn't really pertain to gender dynamics specifically all that deeply. And, that's perfectly fine as an FYI. Finally, The Enchanted delves into the profoundly flawed, or rather wounded, depths of the human heart. Like I said earlier, all the strands of the book's theming are tightly interwoven, and this particular thread is inextricable from the narrative's exploration of trauma, the cycle of violence, the moral values we place on life, death, and justice, and the ways we, as individuals and as a society, make sense, or try to make sense at any rate, of it all. All of the characters in this story are flawed. Some more severely than others, some more criminally and evilly, however one understands that word, than others, right? I mean, there are criminals on death row in the story, but the story shows light can still sometimes seep into very broken souls, that even good people, again, however one understands that concept, can struggle with dark and destructive impulses, to varying degrees, of course. That pure evil, well, that it does exist, yes, but that it rarely, if ever, comes out of nowhere. There is so much here in these mere 230 or so pages to reflect upon and feel about human morality, human pain, and yes, in a way, human redemption, though I don't think redemption as such is really a focal point of the theming. I was just really moved by the story and felt a lot of very, what I'll term, neutral compassion and sadness reading about the horrible things human beings do to one another, and those like the lady who try to bridge and heal the gaps created by this horror, despite everything and, however imperfectly. I do want to stress again that there is no soapboxing here. I say this because one might potentially and understandably think too much sympathy is afforded to individuals who truly have committed horrific acts of violence. The lady herself, in the narrative, stresses that the vast vast majority of her clients are in fact guilty of very violent crimes. But this is not the case at all, and I wouldn't have been moved the way I was had it not been the case, given I myself hold my rapist very much accountable for his actions and want to see him punished for them. Abusive and traumatic backgrounds are shown in the story, but the adult criminal's responsibility is never minimized. Evil, once again to put it in stark but simple terms, is never excused or justified by any of the story's characters, at least none of the, broadly good ones. It is simply shown that, more often than not, this evil is created, not born, and that it may thus potentially be preventable. Prison is neither presented as an ideal solution, but nor is it presented as a morally unacceptable one. The death penalty certainly isn't presented in a favorable light, but a character is nonetheless given space to try and make sense of its continued existence, in the United States at least, as he grapples with the unfairness of seeing his wife, a good woman, dying of cancer when violent sociopathic criminals get to be taken off of death row. The theming here is not entirely neutral either. Enlightened centrism, to put it in rather memey terms, rarely makes for deeply engaging material, right? But it is wonderfully nuanced and anchored ultimately in compassion. The Enchanted is what I would call a quietly hard-hitting story. I'm pretty sure I read at least a solid third of it with tears of just raw emotion in my eyes. It made me feel and think in concert about issues I rarely engage with in this specific fashion. I've more so read stories dealing with sexual abuse specifically, but not really the broader cycle of violence and criminality or its handling by the justice system. I rated it with a very solid 7.5 out of 10, and now consider it a soft new general fiction favorite. Interestingly enough, it also reminded me of the TV show Orange is the New Black a little, which, by the way, is a show I thoroughly enjoyed and which also made me feel all the feels. The stories are decently different, of course, but I also think they both strike similar enough thematic notes. Either way, I would, yes, very highly recommend this one, though do keep in mind that, as I believe I've made pretty clear throughout my review, it does deal with very dark things indeed. And that concludes my review of Renee Denfeld's The Enchanted. I hope you found this review interesting, informative, and or engaging, all those good things. If you want to share thoughts, feelings, what have you about it in the comments down below, you're more than welcome to, or why not join the channel's Discord server if you feel so inclined. And on that very final note, I hope you'll have a lovely day, evening, or whichever time of day you prefer. As usual, do take good care of yourselves. Thank you for the continued support. I shall see you all quite soon in the next video, but until then, bye-bye.